Welcome to this UCL EAST lunch hour lecture. I'm Paola Lettieri, Professor of Chemical Engineering at UCL and Director of UCL EAST, our new campus that is being built on the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park. Today's lecture is on robotics, and we welcome Professor Steve Hales, Head of Computer Science at Imperial College at UCL, and Steve is leading the development of the robotics and artificial intelligence programs for UCL EAST. So robotics is an incredibly fascinating area at the intersection of different disciplines, integrating computer science and engineering. Robots, in fact, are composed of mechanical, electronic, and computer-based components. And increasingly, roboticists are learning from and influencing also other subjects, such as architecture and zoology. So Steve graduated with a PhD from Cambridge University and came to work at UCL nearly 30 years ago, researching in the area of multimedia systems. And since then, over the years, his research interests have spanned from security, in which he was one of the founders of the field of computational trust, and then into networking and mobile and sensor systems, with a variety of applications that have led Steve to work with colleagues from across different disciplines, really spanning animal biology, earth sciences, all the way to neuroscience, psychiatry, and clinical medicine. So before handing over to Steve, let me remind you that you can post questions on Slido, and the code for today is LHL2, and we will answer your questions after the talk. Steve, over to you.
Thanks very much, Paola. As Paola said, I am Stephen Hales, and I am head of UCL Computer Science, most definitely. Okay, today I'm going to have a talk to you about robotics in general, where it's come from, what it means at the moment, and where I think it's going, and how UCL EAST plays a part in this picture. So I'm going to share my slides now. So that one I think is the right one. Yep. Okay. So let's start the talk by talking a bit about what robots are and what robotics is and what the challenges are within it. So let's start with why it's important. Well, if we think about the future of society, it's almost inconceivable that robots won't play a massive part in the future of society. They're already playing a part in medicine, in surgical robotics, and there's a lot of work going on in that area at UCL. They're playing roles in surveillance, in mapping, in all sorts of things at the moment. And as a result of that, the government have declared robotics and autonomous systems to be one of the 8 great technologies, with potentially enormous markets into the future. A lot of robotics at the moment tends to exist outside the direct public gaze, but for the future, it's likely to come more into the home. It's likely to form a bigger part of our lives. So, as Paola said, I mean, robotics is at the moment an interdisciplinary field. It's one that integrates computer science and various engineering disciplines. And the question for this talk a bit is whether actually it will broaden out more and whether it will become a discipline in itself. So let's make a start with what's a robot. So what I typically do with these things to get a sense of what the public view of a robot is to look at the images generated from a Google search. And you can see that the popular perception of a robot is largely as a humanoid type robot here. In any robotic system, there are a variety of components. So there are sensors that take readings, that take images from the real world. There are actuators that make changes to the robot so it moves. And then there's something that sits in the middle that acts as the glue, that's a form of control. So given some sensor information, we change the actuators based on an algorithm. So if we look at the definition of a robot, it's basically that it's a machine capable of carrying out a complex series of actions automatically, especially one programmable by a computer. The automatic bit is becoming autonomous in the future. So the merging of these electromechanical components with artificial intelligence is leading us to a point where robots are becoming more autonomous. At the basic level, robotics sounds very simple. It's sensors, it's actuators, it's some control. But in reality, that's not quite the case. So let's play. Right, so this is from 2015. It's a DARPA robotics challenge. And these are the fails. This is the fail reel. So the question is, why is it challenging? I've just presented that it's a relatively simple thing to do. But actually, in reality, it's challenging because we often have very high level, very complex goals. So search a building, clean the house, play football, are quite complex, very high level goals that have to result in behaviors that are down at the level of moving a motor from one place to another. The environments in which these kinds of robots exist are very dynamic and very complex. It's not easy to pick out what's in a scene, let alone what to do with it once you have done. They have to handle their own dynamics. It's quite complex for them to do that. And there's a lot of noise in the system as well. So let's see if this will play. That was 2015. This is late 2020. So this was posted in, oh, this is not working. This is posted in December. It's one of the Boston Dynamics robots, or it should be one of the Boston Dynamics robots. And it's now achieved a level of facility that looked improbable 5 years ago. In fact, it's achieved the pinnacle of artistic expression, dad dancing. So that's where robotics is right at the moment. But this talk is really about transdisciplinarity. Yeah, at the moment we have robotics as an interdisciplinary subject, but in future, my view is it will become a discipline in its own right through a process of transdisciplinarity. So let's have a talk about that. Intradisciplinary or disciplinary is just a single discipline. It's working within a single coherent discipline. Often that leads to multidisciplinarity, where we have people from different disciplines working together, each drawing on knowledge from their own discipline and coming together to solve the problem. Cross-disciplinarity is something where people view other disciplines from the perspective of their own, but they're starting to understand other disciplines. Interdisciplinary involves integrating knowledge from different disciplines, and transdisciplinary involves creating a unity of intellectual frameworks that goes beyond simple disciplinary perspectives. Now, this is only one view of these terms, and these terms are often used for each other, but this is one that I've adapted from something I found on the web. If we look, however, at the way that roboticists express what the grand challenges in robotics are, then this is a view of that, right? So this is the grand challenges of the journal Science Robotics. This was the result of an open online survey on major unsolved challenges, which narrowed down those challenges to something like 30 topics. And those were then further refined down to 10 grand challenges. Now, what you can see from this is that much of what's on here is really focusing on robots, focusing on the robots and the robotics at the moment. It's still got that interdisciplinary feel, and it's broadening its scope. So we're starting to see things like biohybrid robots in there, so robots that are part biological agent, part computational agent. And we start to see things like social interaction as well, and consideration of robot ethics in there, but it's still really very focused on robots, making effective robots. So what I promised in this talk was something that goes from architecture to zoology. And actually, there are two pieces of work here that I'm going to talk a little bit about, and a little bit about the interaction of architecture and zoology with robotics, what we can learn from them, and what we can learn from these pieces of work. This is a piece of work by Golshid. She was an MSc student a couple of years ago, but Golshid's a card-carrying architect. It's something we published in an ICRA workshop, and actually it won the Best Poster award there. What we started to look at here was the idea of using origami robots. Okay, so this was inspired by self-reconfigurable robots. So the idea here was that within a disaster relief situation, you'd like to be able to ship a robot as a flat pack, ship a shelter or robot shelter as a flat pack entity, and have it construct itself, adapting to the terrain and the conditions in which it finds itself. So this is an example of something that's not that. It's actually an IKEA flat pack emergency shelter. Our view was that what we could do was something that was more dynamic in nature, that was more adaptive. And this was based on some work done before on origami robots. So robots which have structures where they can bend, they can fold, and actuators to make them do this. Okay. These kinds of robots are good in environments which are dynamic and unknown, where they have to adapt to those environments. And the idea here is that we can create structures that are versatile, that can be adapted, that can be adapted to need as well as to environment, but robust, things that will survive environmental conditions. So the idea here is to start with a two-dimensional form and then to create a three-dimensional shape out of that. Now, very much like taking a sheet of paper and putting origami folds in it, you can turn what is a flat structure into something which is three-dimensional. So if we put folds, a mixture of sort of mountain and valley folds around the edge of a square of paper, then you'll find that if you pick the center up vertically, then you can create actually a number of structures, but here's one of them. Now, when we create this structure, what we find is that it's become three-dimensional, but other things have happened. So the vertex, if you can see V9 here, it's moved in. So we started with a flat plane of paper, we've turned it into a three-dimensional shape, and actually that's changed the area that it covers. Well, that's fine, and paper is flexible, and actually we know that origami is a relatively straightforward thing to do. What happens if, firstly, the structures are not flexible, so we can't get away with bending it, or we can't get away with bending it very much because the faces are rigid here. That makes life a lot more complicated if we want to transform into arbitrary shapes. And what if this is part of a larger structure? So I'll come back to the second one. We could, in transforming this, make our lives quite a lot easier by putting cuts into the system. So if instead of a fold, we have a cut, then actually there are more shapes that we can make out of that. But we lose structural integrity by doing that. And so the purpose of this piece of work was to look at what we could do without changing the nature of the structure itself. If we think about larger structures, this looks like an element of something that could be a larger structure. We can have many such structures connected together. Now, the thing is that if we go back to raising the point in the center here to turn this into a 3D shape, then the vertices around the edge move, but they're now connected to other vertices in other parts of the structure. And so moving this becomes even more complex, yeah, because things are linked. Okay. So the inspiration for this, as I said, Goldschid's an architect. The inspiration for this comes from generations of architects and their buildings. The likes of Gaudi, this is the La Sagrada Familia, Friato, and Foster and Partners. These structures are interlinked. If you make a change in the structure somewhere, then actually that induces changes elsewhere. So this is a very similar idea to conventional unified architectural structures. Okay, so from a technical point of view, what are we trying to achieve? We're trying to say, if we want to achieve a desirable geometric conformation, three-dimensional conformation of our originally piece of paper, we need to find a way of moving the structure, so moving all of those vertices and those faces from where it is to where it needs to be. We don't want to cut the surface, so we can't change the way that the bits are connected. And we want to do this in a reasonably computationally inexpensive way. But it's rigid, we have predefined folds, and we can't bend the structure too much. And the sensors here that tell us the angles between the different faces are noisy. So they don't return true values. They return something that approximates a true value. Now, that's important because we can't actually know exactly what the shape of something is. We can only get an approximation to that. Okay, so here's our approach. Our approach is, let's take a desired shape. So let's go back to the shape that we started with. And this is our desired three-dimensional shape. This is where we want to end up. We start on the left-hand side here with a flat shape. Yeah. And there are several ways we could go about trying to get from this to this without violating any of the constraints we've got. The constraints are that everything is rigid, so the faces are rigid here. Now, we could do this using some maths, but it turns out that the maths is complex and computationally extremely heavy, and in reality, not really very tractable. what we have chosen instead to do is something that interpolates. So we perturb the shape a little bit on the route to becoming what we want the final shape to be. And we have a number of steps in this. And at each stage, what we do is we perturb it and we allow the rigidity constraints to be violated in that perturbation. But then what we do is we, in non-technical terms, we jiggle it a bit until actually the rigidity constraints are actually satisfied. So we start with a shape, we move it to where we would like it, a step on the way of the route towards where we would like it to be. That may violate link lengths here, but to satisfy those link lengths, we move things slightly until it does, and that becomes our next step. And then we repeat that process each time, perturbing it on the route to where we want it to be, and then moving it slightly, perturbing it slightly so that the constraints are satisfied. We tried this over a whole range of different shapes. So these are hand-created shapes. These are the shapes we would like to be able to create here. And what we did was we started with a flat sheet and we built up a whole range of interpolations on the way between the flat sheet and each of these shapes. So there are 58 target shapes there, and through interpolation, we ended up with something like 11,000 different conformations, all of them satisfying those rigidity constraints. Now, what this gives us is a whole series of examples of shapes that are legitimate. It gives us examples of the values for different joints, the angles between those joints, and actually, given the angles between those joints, where the bits of the robot end up in space, in Cartesian space, in 3D space. As I said, we assume that there's noise in the system. And so the first thing we have to do, given some sensor values on the angles between the different faces, is we have to take the noise out of that. So once we've done that, we can figure out what the current 3D shape is. We can plan the trajectory to the next 3D shape, and then we can set the joint angles for that shape and move towards it. Okay. Now, quite a lot of this process is mathematically complicated or computationally complicated. And so, unlike many other systems, what we've chosen to do is we've chosen to use machine learning. In fact, two types of machine learning, one to do the denoising and one to do this forward kinematic step here, in order to reduce the amount of computational effort required. Okay. We've evaluated this, so we came up with another set of shapes to evaluate it on, and we tested the routes between, again, flat shapes and these shapes, given the learning that's happened on the other shapes that we've done. So these, as far as the system is concerned, had never been seen before, but other shapes had learned from the other shapes. And these, it's able to recreate these shapes, having learned how to do that from a training set. So what does that look like? So we've got these two steps. We start with some noisy conformation, noisy joint angles. When we denoise those, that changes the shape. Yeah, it gives us a better approximation to the actual shape. And if we look at the actual shape, it's very close to the denoised version. if we assume that this is a 2 meter by 2 meter shape, and what we're trying to do is turn it from flat to some structure, then what we find is that during that process, there are errors at each stage in that process. And those errors really correspond to how much we've had to bend the structure. And those errors are very small, right? So in essence, what this final error is telling us is that we're having to bend the structure by on the order of a millimeter or two over a 2 meter horizon. And that's well within any engineering tolerances. An interesting thing we found actually was that in going from 3-dimensional shapes to 3-dimensional shapes, what it learned to do was really go back to a flat 2-dimensional shape and build back up again from that 2-dimensional shape to the new 3-dimensional shape. But the errors actually got quite large, close to the flat structure. So what did we learn?
I couldn't find an app by that.
Oh, stop it. So what did we learn? We learned that we can apply machine learning, deep learning in this case, to generate systems that have these geometric constraints in them. We learned that we can maintain the connectivity across the system. We don't have to cut parts of our origami robot, and that the errors we create are low, even in the presence of noise, and low enough that we would be able to build these robots without actually violating any engineering constraints. It's computationally tractable. We've managed to learn interesting things here, and that makes it computationally tractable. And actually, given that we can apply it to this relatively simple problem, we now know that we can apply it to a whole variety of different patterns of lattice-shaped modular robots. Now, this is a piece of work, but there's an awful lot more going on in the field of robotics and architecture. And one of the things that we're investigating, in fact, here EAST, is in a collaboration between CS, CEG, and Bartlett, is about robotics in construction. Yeah, how to build things using robots, how to monitor sites using robots. What this is saying, this is a webpage of an architect's, and what it's saying here is that this technology is here to stay. Actually, it's going to become a fundamental part of the architectural process for the future. That could be in terms of structures, it could be in terms of construction, it could be in terms of all sorts of things. It opens new possibilities. So there's a question: is this computer science? Is it architecture? Or is it something else? Is it part of a new discipline? Is it just interdisciplinary work, or is it something richer than that? Is it best done not by a computer scientist and an architect, but by someone like Golshid, who actually has expertise in both of these areas? Okay, that was architecture. Let's look at zoology. So this is work done by Michelle Reeve, and I was privileged to be one of her PhD supervisors. Michelle did her PhD at the Royal Veterinary College, split between RVC and UCL. And this is really about the biology of Spidergate, but with a view to applying that in robotics. So, question: why on earth use legs? Well, the answer is, these are mountain goats in the video, versatility. So we've got highly complex terrains, and you can't imagine actually using wheels or even tracks in these kinds of domains. Legs are a really effective mechanism of moving around this space. But legs bring quite, make for quite complex systems, and actually potentially consume quite a lot of power as well. So understanding how animals that have evolved over millennia have adapted to their environments is likely to tell us something about ways of reducing this complexity and making the power consumption more efficient. So why are we studying this? Well, it's for both purposes of basic biology. It's good to understand biology generally. It's good to understand what seem to be relatively simple animals, but turn out to be quite complex when you look at them closely. They're used to moving in uneven environments, and they adapt their gait there. And we'd like to know how they do it. And we'd like to be then able to take that and apply it in the biological domain, in the robotic domain, and potentially from that application, then create biological questions that we can go back to biology and explore. So different gaits in animals are optimized for all sorts of things, right? So they could be optimized for speed or energy. They could be reducing forces on the musculoskeletal system, and they can be adapted due to terrain, rough terrain, or obstacles in the environment, or even injury and damage. And I'll come back to that one specifically very shortly. So this is a cockroach running at speed. And what we see here is a small cannon is about to fire sideways to try and disrupt the cockroach stride, and it makes almost no difference. So the cockroach reacts really quickly to quite a substantial perturbation here. So it's reacted within 10 milliseconds, and it's recovered within 40 milliseconds. And that's a mixture of mechanical design. So there's actually a mechanical feedback system that's partly down to the carapace of the cockroach, and the fact that the neural signals here are not making their way to the central nervous system. They're acting directly between the environment and the musculoskeletal system. So it's a good way of having very quick reactions. Okay. Now, as I said, why we're studying spiders here. Why spiders? Well, partly because both Michelle and I are fascinated by spiders, but actually because spiders are universal creatures. They're very ancient creatures, and they live in many different environments. They're very versatile as a consequence, and actually they're easy to obtain. We live with spiders. They use their legs for a whole variety of purposes, not just locomotion. So they use them for weaving webs or hunting or jumping. Some spiders jump, for example. And there's been a history of spider-inspired robots. Now, spider legs are hydraulic in nature. So a spider lacks some leg extensor muscles, and the way it extends its legs is by shutting a valve to its lungs and raising its blood pressure and opening a valve to the relevant leg, and that stretches the leg out, or helps stretch the leg out. And so quite a lot of research that's been done in spider-inspired robots has focused on that hydraulic mechanism, or actually on things which are sort of spider-shaped rather than spider-inspired. We've tried some work on this. So this is the work of another MSc student, inspired by Michelle's work with real spiders. We built a pneumatic spider leg to look at the control mechanisms for that. But from Michelle's work, what we're really looking at is not just the mechanism for a single leg, but how legs go down collectively. So if you imagine a six-legged insect, then typically insects move by putting down three legs, standing on a tripod, which is a stable base, and then moving their other 3 legs and putting those 3 legs down so that they move on to another stable base. Spiders with 8 legs, actually, the presumption is that they move on tetrapods. So alternate legs belong to different tetrapods. So there's an orange tetrapod here and a blue tetrapod. And the assumption is that they move from one set of 4 legs to the other set of 4 legs, again, a stable base to another stable base. It turns out it's more complicated than that, right? And so although it looks a bit like that by eye and from high-speed video, in reality, phases alter with speed. They can be slightly different, even across similar spider species. And the exact relationship, the exact movement pattern, seems to depend on leg position. So there are different phasings depending on where the leg is on the body. Okay. So why are we doing this? Well, the answer is for biological insights. We can learn quite a lot about leg sequencing and phase relationships, which gives us some insight into the underlying structure of pattern generators within the animal. We might be able to propose new models of neural organization. So we already know that for quadrupeds, someone has proposed, Dana has proposed a computer model of spinal circuits that actually matches quite well how gaits change in quadrupeds. We can learn something about leg sequencing, which tells us something about where energy is being spent and how it's being spent. And actually, what we tend to find is that leg sequencing isn't this straightforward alternating tetrapod quite. It's got an element of what's called a metachronal gait, a rippling sort of gait in there as well. And that's interesting. And actually, that gives us information about how we build robots in the future based on those biological insights, and using those to form new hypotheses about the biology and so close the loop. Now, another interesting thing is about autotomy. So spiders with 8 legs, the 8 legs give them advantages in terms of movement, but they can also carry a disadvantage. It gives predators more to get hold of them by. It also makes it, if spiders are moving over rough environments, legs can get trapped. So spiders have evolved a mechanism of autotomy. They can drop their legs. Yeah, they just lose legs. And anything up to about 40% of spiders found in the wild have lost 1 or more legs. Now, actually, this doesn't have a huge amount of effect on pretty much anything that spiders are interested in doing, up to a certain point. Yeah, but it's interesting to see how they change their gait when they lose legs, because we can imagine opportunities in robotics where, again, 8-legged robots, but where a leg gets trapped, let's say in an uneven environment, and can't be recovered, we could drop it and just find a way of adapting our gait to deal with 7 legs or 6 legs, whatever we're left with. Now, we try this in 2 different types of spider, the wolf spider and the European garden spider, which is an orb weaver. The wolf spider hunts prey, doesn't make a web at all. It hunts prey, sort of sneaks up on it and jumps on it. But the orb weaver weaves a web, right? Now, what we found was that when spiders had all their legs, the wolf spiders moved faster because it's in their interest to move faster. But actually, they had a broader range of speeds. And in fact, they had 2 distinct speeds, a slow speed and a faster speed. And their gait changed as the speed changed. For the orb weavers, the range was much smaller and actually only had a single gate. We looked at their gate after autotomy, and you can see that if it's intact, it's moving here. If it's lost a limb, then actually the speed drops really very considerably, but it can still move. And in fact, if it loses 2 limbs, the speed increases slightly. Now, this is probably to do with the effort of synchronization in some way. We don't know at the moment. And we don't see it replicated, don't see that pattern replicated in the orb weaver. Now, we've taken that into design of our own robots. So these are obviously very simple robots, but the finger on the right-hand side is pointing at legs that have been taken out of commission, right? So again, what you can see from this is that sort of metachronal gait. It's moving as a tetrapod, but there's a rippling effect through the tetrapod as they're moving forwards. And in the case where a limb has been taken out of action, it can still move. So we've learned something we can apply actually to robotic systems. So I think I've said most of this at the moment. We learned quite a lot about the biology of spiders, and we learned how to apply that biological insight to robotics. There's plenty more to do here. We can look more at rough terrain. So our spiders all ran on planar environments or relatively simple environments. We didn't look at them in terms of vertical surfaces. We didn't really, in that, look at egg sacs or adding weight to spiders. They're used to carrying eggs around. And robots that can carry things are always useful. And there's a bunch of more work that we can do on biomimetic robotics here. Okay, so where does this come to when we start thinking about UCL EAST? Well, as Paula once said, the big challenges in the world are likely to be solved when we move beyond what have become traditional academic boundaries. Now, we'll re-establish new boundaries, but we need to be breaking down those barriers in order to achieve the most we can achieve out of this. Now, that's fundamental to the philosophy of UCL EAST. And actually, in terms of the robotics world, at the moment, robotics is an interdisciplinary subject. It's got a long history stretching back decades into industrial robotics. But the growth and the reach and its importance for the future means that actually we really need to be considering non-traditional robotics disciplines and fusing those into the mix of those that have traditionally been associated with robotics. It offers a new opportunity to create robotics offering which has disciplinary depth. We need people who understand the electronics and the mechanical systems and the control. We need people who have an interdisciplinary mindset, who will work with others to achieve interesting goals. But actually, we want people who are looking to create a new discipline here. So they've got a transdisciplinary outlook. When I was young, when I joined UCL, as Paula kindly said, nearly 30 years ago, many people in computer science did not have a degree in computer science. It was an unusual thing for an academic in computer science to have a degree in it. At the moment, we're in that position with robotics. So many of the people going into robotics may have a PhD in it, they may even have a master's in it, but they almost certainly have a first degree in something else, mechanical engineering or computer science. I think that ultimately the creation of a new discipline means that we can look at teaching from much earlier on to put together an educational program as well as a research program that looks distinct. It becomes a new discipline. So where I came in here was in the work with UCL EAST. The initial proposal we put together was something that I kind of cooked up with Alan Penn, who at that point in time was the Dean of the Bartlett, which was about buildings as an organism. So not just architecture, but robots within that architecture. So robotic legged robots in the walls of a building performing functions like, I don't know, changing light fittings, cleaning the environment, you know, rearranging electrical connections, running wires, all sorts of things they could be doing. At the moment, we tend to build buildings for human beings. I think in future, we'll build buildings for humans and robots as well. And so we end up not actually just with point connections between robotics and architecture and robotics and zoology, but actually something that encompasses them all. So that's the end of this presentation, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Steve. That was absolutely fascinating. There is a question that I can see, actually a couple of questions have appeared in Slido, so I will read out the first question. So could you tell us more about how robots learn to adapt to different environments like spiders do?
Okay, that's a really interesting question, actually. So it's very difficult to know exactly how spiders adapt. But here's a lesson we learned from spiders. So if spiders have got 8 legs, they walk on alternating tetrapods. Okay, so they walk on 4 legs, then 4 legs. If they lose 2 legs, then if they lose them from different tetrapods, then they're left with tripods, and they just walk on alternating tripods instead. It's still stable. But what if they lose 2 legs from the same tetrapod? So now you've got 4 legs, 2 legs. Now 2 legs is not stable. So they could do 4 legs and then kind of hop over the 2 legs and land on 4 legs again. Or they could rewire themselves. They've still got 6 legs. They could rewire themselves to use alternating tripods. And that's exactly what they do. They do it so fast that it must be innate, right? They're not really learning this on the fly. So how do we learn these things? How do computers learn these things? Well, they learn from example. Machine learning techniques at the moment need lots of examples. Now, there's only really 2 ways of getting these. Build a robot and run it for a long time to get lots of examples, try different things, see how they work or don't work. That takes an inordinate amount of time. Or we create simulations of the environment, and which are realistic, and we run it in computation many times over many computers. In fact, with that 8-legged robot that I showed you, one of the videos I didn't show for this was actually a learned gait. So we did exactly that. We built a simulation of the system. We actually learned over that simulation, and then we applied it back in the real robot. If your simulation is good enough, then it's good enough. In complex environments, the question is, what's good enough, right? So we have potential for uneven environments. We have potential for legs to be trapped. There may be slip in the environment. If you go back to the mountain goats, you could see it sliding down, one of them sliding down a mountain face as well. It's just a different way of moving. And so at the moment, we're really in the foothills of this. It's very difficult to simulate those kinds of very friable surfaces in any meaningful way at the moment. So it's a mixture of experiment and simulation, is the answer to that.
Thank you. So the next question is from Christos, and is asking, could you please mention a few more details about the machine learning training? What type of training was used and which model was chosen?
So we did the machine learning for the architecture used two things. It used an autoencoder for the denoising process. So we're trying to reconstruct the original from that, and it used a system of deep learning with a variable number of layers in the middle of the neural network. And we did some assessments to figure out how many layers were necessary. It turns out that you don't get very much in the way of improvement past sort of 6-ish layers, but we ended up using about 10 layers in the middle. And that was used for the forward kinematics. So given the joint angles, to know what the Cartesian pose of the robot was. We didn't need to use it for the inverse kinematics. Now, actually, in the main, inverse kinematics is the difficult problem. But where you have geometry in the system, you can make use of that geometry to solve for the inverse kinematics much easier than you can use it to solve for the forward kinematics. So it was those two things, for example. For the spider robots, we used a variety of techniques, but again, deep learning across the simulated environment.
Okay, thank you, Steve. So the next question is from Emma, and she's asking you how near in the future do you think dual human and robot buildings will exist?
Frankly, I'd like to build one. I would quite like a UCL EAST to have been such a thing. I think the technology is pretty much there at the moment. If you think about vacuuming robots, for example, they exist. Trouble is that buildings typically have doors on them. And getting through that door is a really fundamental problem for a robot. Now, we could create a robot like you may have seen the Spot robot that's got an arm on the top of it that could open doors. But why don't we just build a building where robots can move much more easily? They don't have to use the same things that humans do. So I think I've talked to a variety of architects about this, and it's an unusual approach at the moment. It's not something that we do. It's not something in which there's even really very much in the way of experiment at the moment. But it is something that we could do, I think. So I think it's more down to willingness to explore than it is the technical barriers that exist.
Excellent. So the next question is from George, and he's saying, what an incredible presentation. It makes me wonder how to mix robotics and biological systems. How to manage interfaces, though?
That's really very interesting. So there has been some work done on biohybrid systems as well. So there's something called optogenetics. So given a light source, you can actually flip a behavior by switching on a blue light. Yeah, you can ensure that you get a particular proteins expressed when you've got light and not when you don't. That can be used to flip behavior in animal, typically insect, robot hybrids. Now, how you control these things then becomes really quite interesting, right? And the uses to which you can put them. So one of the things that spiders are good at is compressing themselves and getting into small gaps, yeah, moving around those kinds of environments. Now, we could imagine that they'd be used for a variety of things. Surveillance could be one, for example, moving around the environment in a covert manner. Now, how would you control them? Well, you could try and have a standard remote control, but actually you've got 8 legs, you can't do that. You need some sort of automatic control. That could be at the level of gait, and you just decide on the direction from the remote control. Or actually, what you could do instead is create a mission of some sort. So move from this room to that room. I don't care how you do it, but just find a way of doing it. Now that requires a bunch more computation. It requires richer sensors. It requires us to be able to look at the environment, look at a scene and understand what that scene means, and understand what the possibilities then for motion are within the context of that scene. But it makes for much simpler tasking. At the moment, larger scale robots we can task in that kind of way. These kinds of mini robots, there's still work to be done in terms of tasking them in that way. But it's still a work in progress. It's still a really quite complex thing to do.
Thank you, Steve. So there is one more question on Slido. It's from the same person as before. Is asking about the experience of UCL in mixing architecture and robotics. Oops, the question has disappeared.
It's gone.
Okay, I've just read half of the question, but hopefully you got the gist of it. So what's the experience at UCL between mixing robotics and architecture?
As I said before, there is already existing work going on. So within computer science, we've got Vijay Parwar is working on using drone-based systems or wheeled robot systems to construct buildings and looking at how we can control things and how we can plan the paths of those robots in such a way that they don't paint themselves into a corner. They actually build up structures which are sound and solid and robust enough. So there is concrete work going on at the moment. But there's an awful lot of potential for the future as well. So at the moment, we're not really exploring robots within the walls of buildings and so forth, but there is the potential to do that. And there is real interest in these structures that deform. So I learned actually earlier this week that one of the members of CS has actually got a patent just granted on a deformable structure. He's been working on it with Microsoft Research.
I think we've got just 1 minute for one final question, and it's about the denoising. So how the denoising machine learning actually works. What you think will be the actuators in that setup?
Okay, so the denoising works not on the actuation, but it works on the sensing side of things. So as I said before, it works using an autoencoder. Now, there are several ways that we could try and do this. So we're talking about additive white Gaussian noise, so zero mean noise, but we did try a range of different standard deviations for that noise here. Most real sensors, at least in my experience, return values which are noisy and where that noise is actually potentially quite nasty as well. So one way of trying to denoise things is to time average different readings. Here, what we're trying to do is minimize the number of readings that we take in order to provide a denoised signal as well. Because if you do that, then you potentially move the structure faster, right? Rather than trying to be sure about what the joint angles are. We know that there are rigidity constraints. We know we can't really have bent the structure too far out of shape. And so what we're trying to do is figure out what is the actual conformation given these estimates of angles. As I said, that's done using an autoencoder and the forward kinematics part of this.
Thank you very much, Steve, for a very interesting talk, and thank you everyone for being with us today. It's 2 o'clock, so we have reached the end of this time slot. If you want to see more fascinating lectures or listen to the UCL podcasts, visit the UCL Minds webpage. But for now, stay well and goodbye.